Okay, I'm gonna get this out of the way just real quick ahead of time. Everything Everywhere All at Once is the story of Evelyn, a middle-aged laundromat owner forced to meet with an IRS agent as part of a tax audit, all while dealing with a strained relationship with her daughter, husband, and father.
Wow, 这个电梯好快哦.
And then there is so much more that you could get into in terms of the premise of the movie, and we will. But suffice to say that this relatively small-time movie got a lot of love when it first came out, which then led to it getting a lot of love. And now it's one of the most acclaimed movies of the last few years. And then...
Totally overrated. Woke Mob loves this movie about stupid film with stupid eyes and stupid sausages and stupid 24 said or watch One Piece or whatever.
Well, if inclusive means every visible white male is simply a punching bag, then yes, it's so inclusive.
Let me just say off the bat that there is nothing that I understand more viscerally than being a hater. I remember I was 13 and it was the first time that I was watching the Oscars, and that was the year that No Country for Old Men swept. And at the time, being 13, I watched that movie and I was like, that movie was stupid. That movie didn't even really have an ending. To just sort of, what was the point? What was the point? The movie didn't even have a point. I also didn't have a great time with Burn After Reading. My opinion's now changed, although I do still feel like on some level it's kind of unfair that you do get those situations in award shows where one movie just picks up all the awards, and then there's other good movies that don't really get anything. I guess over the years my perspective has shifted a little more to maybe none of this matters. When there are these big pop culture event type things, it's hard not to feel like you're kind of under attack when you're not in on it, when everyone else seems to click with this thing. I'll always be an Avatar hater. And I think it's especially difficult with things that are very comedic, because humor is such a sort of subjective thing, even more so than everything else. It's hard to really explain why something is funny to you. It's just kind of and especially when that humor style is sort of strange.
What store are you in? I'm at the soup store! Why are you buying clothes at the soup store? Fuck you!
Because then I think you run into the situation where for the people that do connect with the thing, it's a very personal kind of connection. It's something that feels specific to them, which can make it kind of difficult to talk about the thing in a way that isn't just overwhelming praise. A lot of people really like Life is Strange. A lot of people really like Undertale. But I think I've definitely noticed a certain level of backlash against Everything Everywhere All at Once in light of just people showering it with praise. And I thought, as somebody who does have a very deep personal connection to the movie, it would be a good excuse for me to kind of make my case to those people, to kind of express why it is that I do think it's a very valuable piece of media, why, despite the level of overwhelming praise, I still don't consider it to be overrated. And I do understand ahead of time that there's tons of different reasons that you might just not like the movie, which I will kind of be getting into. But I thought probably the best way for me to start off would just be to say why I like it. Feelings of constant impending planetary doom are sometimes difficult to manage in day-to-day life, and that's why I wanted to thank Ren for sponsoring this segment of the video. Clear your busy mind with a website that helps you calculate your carbon footprint, suggest small ways to reduce it, and figure out projects you can contribute to help make effective, positive environmental change. Help out a project like this one, helping Scottish people repair a damaged ecosystem. Or this one that I thought was a cool premise for a movie about fighting refrigerators, but is actually about the safe disposal of harmful chemicals released by phased-out tech, and that's probably a better use of your money. For a convenient way to do your small part in the climate crisis, start learning today at ren.co. The first 100 people who sign up using the link in the description will have 10 extra trees planted in their name. And if there's one thing I like, it's trees with human names. Check out Ren today. I forgot to address ahead of time also that I'm probably not going to get into a lot of the common points of praise that people generally express about this movie. Everyone gives a fantastic performance. There's so many fun little quirks in the movie and little Easter eggs and things that set the whole thing up. It's just a very well constructed film, something that they've clearly thought a lot about in its production. But that's not what this video is going to be about. I will also say that this is definitely going to go off track on several occasions. To be totally honest with you, I was really afraid of doing a video about this because I was afraid of missing something or fucking up in some way. So I'm just going to do my best here. I'm sorry.
Those overloaded mind usually dies. Instead, her mind was fractured. Now she's seen too much. Lost any sense of morality, any belief in objective truth. All we know is she's looking for you.
Have you ever heard of the coastline paradox? Let's say that you wanted to like map out a region, and obviously you get to the borders and you want to accurately depict the borders of the region. So say you get to a coastline, you want to kind of mark it out. So you do a kind of simple like, yep, here it's like there's a corner bit here. But then if you look a little bit closer, you might see that this corner bit maybe isn't a corner bit. In fact, maybe it's more like this a little bit. You know, there's these little fine details and sort of crevices that if you want to be accurate, you would include those too. But then when you do that, you notice that, well, if I go a bit further in, it's not even really like this. It's like, it kind of keeps going. There's actually more detail I can continue to add to this thing if I want to be the most accurate. So at what point am I now accurate? The coastline paradox to me is just a nice basic way of demonstrating the ways that it's very difficult to accurately represent material reality. I bring it up because at the time I first watched Everything Everywhere All at Once, and before that, I had been struggling with a variation of this in light of the fact that I had become a professional YouTuber. What that basically means is that my hobby of making YouTube videos was now earning me enough money that I could actually consider it to be, like, my job.
My wife confuses her hobbies for businesses. An honest mistake.
Like, I have to explain to the IRS that I make YouTube videos, which is very fun to do. And with this, I started to feel this overwhelming sense of imposter syndrome. From the moment that I reached this position where I could just make videos as my job, I was thinking, you know, why me? Every time I made a video, I felt like on some level I was bluffing. I was bluffing my way into being a YouTuber when in reality I'm just an insane man talking to a camera. And at the time, my way to try to resolve this feeling of imposter syndrome was, okay, I'm gonna do big, comprehensive analysis of all of the big issues of the day. I'm gonna justify my position here by being, you know, the most important academic, intellectual voice on YouTube. And I set my mind on that, and I quickly encountered the fact that I was completely ill-equipped to give any comprehensive take on anything. I realized that I could pick almost any topic, and at a certain point I'd be learning more about it, I'd figure out these new details that obviously I would have to include, and then
connected to those details there would be certain context that would also be worth including.
And obviously everything has a kind of history behind it, so you want to go into the history behind the thing. You also kind of want to talk about things related to the thing a lot of the time. And the history itself clearly goes back a long way, and then you're going to end up talking about things that maybe seem unrelated, but they connect fundamentally to the thing that you're talking about.
And suddenly I was just paralyzed by this feeling that I couldn't make sense of anything. I actually didn't understand anything about the world that we lived in, because the second that I tried to apply some kind of cause and effect, meaning some kind of simple story behind the things that happen in the world around us, I was like, I fell into this kind of nihilistic state that I essentially couldn't really convey anything meaningfully to any group of people. And it was in amongst this that I was also dealing with immigration I had recently needed to renew my green card after living in the US for a few years, getting together the money for that, applying, and then realizing that there was issues with the application, and then suddenly I'm dealing with immigration lawyers who themselves don't have a great handle on exactly how USCIS was going to handle my case. Frustrated with myself, feeling like I was battling this bureaucracy, and I was failing. And I was not only failing with that, I was also failing with my career, because now I was so struck by this feeling of inadequacy that I wasn't just making fun YouTube videos anymore. And the combination of regret, inadequacy, stress about bureaucracy, stress about there being any discernible meaning in our world, led me pretty naturally to Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Bagel!
There's obviously a limit to the specific experiences that I can relate to in Everything Everywhere All at Once. I am neither a middle-aged Chinese American mother, nor a lesbian, tragically. But I also think that it's very fundamental to the movie that there are so many different ways that you can empathize with the people around you. And in the case of Everything Everywhere All at Once, yeah, I would say I empathize. So it's a multiverse movie at a specific time that the multiverse has very quickly become a narrative concept that I don't want to hear about ever again. And I think it's really unfortunate because, as I understand it, when the Daniels were working on the movie initially, it wasn't that much of a pop culture phenomena. It was just, I guess, a case of bad timing. And I remember reading about how one of them saw Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and then was just like, oh, so I guess people are already going to be sick of this by the time the movie comes out now. They've already dealt with all of the things, and I would say I'm glad that they ended up making the movie anyway. Certainly I would say that Into the Spider-Verse is like second best as far as using this multiverse concept as a way to meaningfully explore something interesting in a story. And then after that, of course, there's Doctor Strange 2 with the Reed Richards cameo. I mean, that was great. That was just great filmmaking. Something I found out in the process of making this video that I have in common with one of the directors, Daniel Kwan, is that I relatively recently found out that I had ADHD. I know that originally a lot of the movie was going to be based around this professor with ADHD using the multiverse as maybe just a way of exploring, like, oh, this is where his mind goes. I think they might have said that it would have been kind of a reductive way of talking about ADHD, but I do really feel like the metaphor works in a lot of ways. In the case of Evelyn's character in the movie, to be lost in these different possibilities, different potential ways that things could have gone, to actually get so lost in them that you end up being almost debilitated from dealing with the reality that's right in front of you. Yeah, as someone that went undiagnosed for decades, I think that was a very relatable experience for me. And you know, the fact that the movie is so bombastically filmed and edited, very much using that music video kind of style that I think the Daniels were mostly known for before they started putting movies out, it made it an easier watch for me, certainly. You get to see Evelyn jump through all of these different realities where all these different absurd things are happening. She ends up basically jumping into the life of the actress who plays her at one point. She ends up in a Ratatouille parody.
I've seen too much. You know what that...
I'm begging you. No.
She ends up in a reality with hot dog fingers. And if I had to make one point absolutely clear, to the people that don't like the hot dog finger stuff in the movie, it's important to understand that the hot dog fingers represent lesbians. I do think genuinely that the point of the hot dog fingers seeming kind of gross is reflective of the fact that Evelyn herself feels that way, and that it's through the process of the movie that she's kind of metaphorically coming to embrace that, to accept that, to see the love in it. Hot dog fingers, the thing I'm gonna most defend of anything in this movie. And then what I love is that the movie then goes on to kind of address the two directions I think that kind of story would go, where someone has access to these kinds of powers. The one that wants to keep chasing after the fantasy, that wants to keep striving after this kind of idealized perfect life that you maybe think you've been denied, or maybe think that you would never have been able to achieve. Of maybe just letting go of the world that you're in and living in the fantasy. A thing that is explored in the film and then is shown as a kind of toxic, corrosive thing that really destroys any hope you have of finding meaning in the life that you actually live in. And at the same time, the ultimate feeling of nihilism that would inevitably come from realizing that you're just one of any billions of possible universes. To realize that you really are such a speck in the grand scheme of the cosmos. I think especially at a time when people are becoming increasingly secular, this nihilism is something that has to be grappled with. Because how do you find meaning when it doesn't come from this external force? How do you generate a purpose? How do you generate sense out of anything? How can you construct a narrative for yourself that you can believe?
I'm going back with my joy to my family to live my life, a happy life. Good luck with that.
Editing Jack stepping in, I meant to make a note here that there's an obvious relationship to this and the modern reality of the internet.
I'm a computer. I'm a computery guy.
An entirely novel human invention which almost any child can now theoretically use to access nearly any public information they desire, and the specific generational problem of having that access and no older generation with the experience to guide anyone through it. It's a new bottomless pit of knowledge, and it's worth keeping that connection in mind for any discussion about millennials and nihilism in the video. I was pretty much Jobu Tapaki. Was it? How's it pronounced? Okay, I want to make sure I get this pronunciation right. Jobu Tapaki. At the time I went into Everything Ever All at Once, I was essentially ideologically Jobu Tapaki. And the interesting thing about it is that at a certain point, it's not even really an ideology. It's more just an expression of depression, an expression of the inability to sort of find a place for myself in the world, to really be able to buy it, to be able to buy the idea that, oh yeah, this is my job, and my job does this, and it's important that I do this and this and that, because then I can continue with my life, which is important, because, you know, faced with the overwhelming coldness and cruelty of our universe, I think it's very natural for a lot of people to just try to sort of shut themselves off from it. I made a video a little while back talking about antinatalism that is definitely a topic I want to go back to at some point, but what really jumped out at me was realizing how much of my audience kind of doesn't feel like there is a humanity that is worth saving. How many people in my audience just were unconvinced by the idea that there was any reason for human beings to kind of strive for their own continued existence. And I don't think a lot of it came out of any feelings of malice, but feelings of just being unconvinced, looking at the world as it is in a rational kind of way, and not really being able to come up with anything to justify the continued existence of this species beyond emotional reasoning or religious thinking. And again, I think there's probably a lot of secularism within my audience. And I don't feel that way. And I had to kind of think for a bit on what was this sort of split that I felt between me and a lot of my audience. I don't think I did a good enough job highlighting how privileged I am to be somebody that grew up in an environment that was very nurturing and very loving, to have a parent that I knew that understood me, or at least made efforts to understand me, that wanted to support me, to the point where I never had to question that love. And as a result, I do feel like I was able to enjoy something that I would say is like a real feeling of love. To even have that to begin with is an experience that I think a lot of people don't get. I think if you don't get that, it is difficult to justify a lot of things. I think that love is, in its own cheesy way, a very powerful force. I don't think that love necessarily has to come from another human being. There's any number of different ways that we can have like these very close personal connections to specific things. And in the end, we kind of have to accept that there isn't really much that goes deeper than that love. Robert Pirsig, who I still really have been meaning to do a video talking about, describes this as static and dynamic patterns. Something that goes deeper than objective or subjective distinctions about our reality. To the simple fact that there are things that we are driven to maintain, to protect, and there are things that we are driven to create. That we are ultimately driven by this overwhelming feeling of love. The things that draw us to things, that push us away from other things, that goes beyond any kind of rationalization. And I think that's very much what Everything Everywhere All at Once seems to be getting at with its conclusion. The understanding that for all the different realities that Evelyn could be living in the reality that she is in, there are things for her to love. That rationalizations are important, but they're not the answer, because there can never be an answer. The horizon will always spread on indefinitely. The Mandelbrot will continue to spiral deeper and deeper. The coastline will never quite be accurately represented.
我们都在里面绕圈子，这我明白，只是我们选择的处理方式不一样。
Like there's always like sliding doors where you like think, oh, what if? But for me, having you, the most rewarding, the most amazing experience of my life, and I don't regret. I regret a lot of my own stupid stuff. Your mistakes make you more compassionate and kinder and just, I think, a nicer person teaches you.
Editing Jack again. I thought it'd be weird not to also bring up the clear symbolism of the alpha verse as symbolic both of control and of masculinity, where the alpha is the stereotypical masculine identity and in this case is the dominant universe with the most rigid sense of correct and perverse behaviors. The Waymond of the film wins by rejecting all of this. He lets his weakness be his strength. He readily admits that he doesn't know what's going on, as none of us do, and it's through this he expresses his humanity and provides the only retaliation against a cold universe. Probably watch the Pop Culture Detective video about this. And I love it for expressing that, but then also expressing how fucking difficult that is.
算了吧，多情自古空余恨，好梦由来追忆醒。
To understand that a lot of the time, loving something just means being constantly stressed about it. You know, when I talk about my immigration stuff, like right now, my main concern is getting back to the UK to be with my family who I love, but also making sure that my partner who I love is able to come with me. The push and pull of trying to navigate that with how utterly abysmal every single immigration system is. Just got the total charge on our visa application, and please consider backing us on Patreon. Please consider backing us on Patreon. Please consider backing us on Patreon. It causes me a lot of stress, and on some level, I guess I could just abandon all of it to just be indifferent to all of this stress, but I know that these are the things that ultimately matter to me, and that without them, I would have nothing that I was particularly motivated by. I think Everything Everywhere All at Once really expresses this deep understanding of those feelings, of how complicated it can be to navigate the things that we feel obligated to do, the things that we really do love, and the feelings that maybe we failed in some way, that we've taken some wrong path, and that this is a feeling that is shared by so many people. I think J.J. Abrams might have said something like, movies are mystery boxes.
So there's that. In terms of the content of it, you look at stories, you think, well, what are stories but mystery boxes?
I tend to go more along with the Roger Ebert way of thinking, that movies are more like empathy machines.
We all are born with a certain package. We are who we are. Where we were born, who we were born as, how we were raised. We're kind of stuck inside that person. And the purpose of civilization and growth is to be able to reach out and empathize a little bit with other people. And for me, the movies are like a machine that generates empathy. It helps us to identify with the people who are sharing this journey with us. And that to me is the most noble thing that good movies can do, and it's a reason to encourage them and to support them and to go to them.
And I would say that the Daniels probably share that general view, seeing as they specifically called out Magnolia.
There's a version of this movie where the first half is The Matrix and the second half fully is Magnolia. This sequence is like a hint towards that, but it proved to be too impossible to write that movie.
Which is my personal favorite movie, and probably the most empathy machine movie ever made. There's so much that matters to me, and there's so much that I want to do, and I just feel constantly reminded of my own inadequacies. And being able to make peace with that, to be able to make peace of the world that you currently live in, I think is just a really difficult thing to grapple with in the modern day, at a time when it feels like there are no straightforward answers to anything in an increasingly complicated existence. It does make me feel like there is a certain level of importance to the movie, and that's without even getting into the obvious LGBT storyline stuff, the very clear relevance that the specific politics of the movie have on current issues. And that's not something that I've really gotten into yet, because I think it leads pretty well into what I really do consider to be one of the better criticisms of the film, or at least something worth addressing. There's been so much talk with this movie talking about immigrant family experiences, and especially Asian American families, how it can be so difficult to connect in certain ways, how it can feel like there is this barrier, not just a language barrier, but also just a barrier in terms of your experience of the world, to the point where the movie is kind of like traumatizing for a lot of people. Now, that's not an experience that I can really speak to. I'm also part of the now most oppressed minority of cis heterosexual people. I never had to deal with coming out to my family or anything like that. So I think from a kind of millennial perspective, I connect to the character of Joy a lot, but there's a lot of aspects to her character that I really don't feel like I could speak to. And one of the criticisms that I do see a lot of people express is that they really think that Evelyn gets off pretty light in the film. And doubly so with her dad, who gets kind of reformed with like almost no screen time. It reminds me a lot of the criticism that I remember hearing around the time of the Steven Universe finale, setting up all of these understandably traumatizing things that this antagonistic force was doing, and then like very quickly kind of resolving everything in this very like nice, clean, happy way. And the Daniels themselves have acknowledged the ways that the sort of wrap up for Everything Everywhere All at Once do kind of resolve things very cleanly and neatly and simply with Evelyn and Joy in a way that is not usually reflective of reality.
I'm realizing, now that more Asian Americans have watched this, is like how profound it is to allow our parents, an image of themselves fully expressing themselves, because that's just not normally what the family dynamic ever is. So it's like these characters had to go through hell and back just to be able to have a traditional Hollywood ending or a traditional emotion fest that usually we don't get to see in real life.
Now, obviously, it is a movie, but I can't help but feel like, yeah, if that was your experience, and then you're seeing this movie that's kind of trying to address it while ignoring certain difficult things, I can see how that would definitely rub up against certain audiences the wrong way. The basic tension is this. You can come to terms with things. You can make peace with things. You can come to all be kind of harmoniously, like, okay with how things are, etc., etc. But what do you do when something in your life is actually unjust? And I think it is a pertinent question, especially when we're dealing with an immigrant family living in a country that often is not treating those immigrant families very fairly. You know, we are dealing with state institutions. I can imagine that people maybe would have come away having slightly more complicated feelings if this is a story about Evelyn making peace, maybe not with the IRS, but with US immigration that often is hostile and difficult to navigate and unfair. I do appreciate that the character of Jamie Lee Curtis specifically is not set up to just be this malicious monster, but a product of a system that has also chewed her up and spit her out, burned out, a cog in a machine, and Jamie Lee Curtis plays that nuance perfectly. I still think Stephanie or Angela should have won. Sometimes things that happen aren't just a result of people's choices, but are the result of the conditions that they were raised under. Sometimes parents aren't willing to apologize. Sometimes there will always be that chasm of understanding. Yeah, you might have this desire to have this like neat resolution to everything, but at what point are you gonna stand up for yourself? Are you gonna say, no, like me just making peace with this is not going to deal with the problem that exists? The tragic reality is that open resolutions between people that have these complicated relationships just don't happen very often. And that is something that the movie doesn't really have time to necessarily get into. The movie mostly embraces a very absurdist perspective that I think can be helpful in combating that depressive nihilism that I think a lot of people kind of face. But I do feel like on a lot of levels that absurdism doesn't make room for ideas like justice. We can talk about how, you know, at the end of the day, the only thing that really matters is who you love, you create your own story, etc., etc. But there can be material problems. There can be things that need to be addressed, and you're not just going to be able to make peace with, be it an intolerant family member or a malicious state institution. To that I will say, while obviously movies don't necessarily need to address every possible angle of a problem, especially when it's something as complicated as the things that Everything Everywhere All at Once is trying to handle, I do think the film itself, in embracing not just a sort of coming to peace with things, but also a willingness to change, that I think is something that helps with the movie embracing this very absurdist view on reality, to still understand that at a certain point there's going to be things that you might need to adjust your view on. It's not just a movie about people learning to tolerate each other just so they can blithely sort of be like, oh well, I guess everyone's kind of whatever, I guess it doesn't really matter, whatever, everyone's cool. Yeah. Instead it's about people learning to see each other, to be able to understand each other so that they are able to change, to be able to make those changes so that maybe life can be a little better for each other. It's not something that I think I can easily resolve, especially because, again, I don't have quite the same experiences. But that's my view on it, if that's the specific kind of way that you don't like Everything Everywhere All at Once. Now, the other side of the criticism, I think, is just people that think the movie is sort of cringe and Reddit and Rick and Morty and kind of like an episode of Rick and Morty. So here's what I'll say. Going back to the hot dog fingers thing, I do think the absurdity is important. I think the embarrassing cringe elements are actually sort of vital to the fact that Evelyn as a character is someone who is herself kind of pushing against this. You know, someone who wants to take herself very seriously, that is increasingly estranged with her husband that sort of wants to turn everything into a big joke. I think we all have to, on some level, admit that all of our lives are stupid and ridiculous is something I've kind of had to embrace as somebody who makes a living calling children's movies fascist. That's it, that's all that I do. As you can see, all I've been talking about is children's movies, like Smile. Do not kill the cringe, kill the part of you that's... what is that? Me trying to get away from being cringe has really only hampered me for most of my life. I am who I am. And yeah, obviously, when I edit these videos, I think it's cringe as fuck. I've just been talking to an inanimate object for like an hour and a half. I feel stupid. Look at this. Look at this. Imagine being that. And through all of the things that Evelyn experiences in the movie, she learns to embrace that cringe part of herself. And I'm totally fine with the way that the movie chooses to express that. Now, obviously, this is one of those like, oh, it's the point, so you're not allowed to say it's bad things. I do think that it's important that there's like elements that seem silly and absurd. I also understand if you just don't like that anyway. Rerun the part earlier where I say bad things about Undertale. Sometimes, even if it is such a vital part of the personality of a certain piece of media, and it seems like it resonates with everyone else, it still just doesn't click with you. And, you know, I do think it's very different from Rick and Morty humor. There's something about, like, wholesome absurdity that I usually find to be a lot less obnoxious than sort of like edgelord absurdity. Probably a distinction that I would struggle to explain right now, but you know what I mean, like Rick and Morty. Like, I hope that I've done an okay job of kind of explaining why it is that the movie does have like a very personal connection to me, why I think it is a very valuable film, and I actually really appreciate the fact that it's gotten so much acclaim over the last few months. If you were caught up in that sort of overhype wave, and you watched the movie and it just sort of didn't click with you, I would recommend a second watch. It is one of those movies that I understand getting caught up in the hype cycle for, but that I do really appreciate as kind of being a bit of like a coming together moment for people. Fucking hell, we really needed one for a while. And you know, like if you just hated it, if you just thought it was really cringe, then I doubt that you got to the end of this video because it's way more cringe than that. You know what I also saw? Creed 3. Now that shit, that was, look, if you thought that Everything Everywhere All at Once was cringe, wait until you see a boxing movie that is explicitly taking inspiration from Dragon Ball Z. And I thought that shit was extremely cool. And also I'm probably doing a video about Creed soon. Thank you for watching, folks. If you liked the video, feel free to use the support links down below. I also thought that this would probably be a relevant video to thank you all for the amount of support that you've given with the Eden Night campaign that I was posting about last week. If you haven't watched the video already, I would recommend doing so. It's a really tragic story. But I'm very grateful for the fact that we ended up making over $8,000 for Trans Lifeline. I'm very proud of the community that tends to come to these videos, and I look forward to reading your comments down below. Also, if you become a patron, you will be part of these credits that are scrolling now, and... oh, they just went. Thanks for watching, folks.